Natasha Jonas, a two-weight world champ.
The wait is over. Fight over Alan Dame. Remember the name. Big shot. She is star quality.
Absolutely extraordinary, unbelievable scenes at Manchester Arena.
This is the next generation, and we're coming to take what's ours.
Not bad, Ben. Not bad. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Ben, thank you for being here as well. And how do you feel when you watch that? That's sort of 30 seconds of your life over the past, 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, it's crazy looking back. There's not many times that you get to. Obviously, you see the bright lights there and the big events, but boxing is, as you can imagine, multifaceted. There's so many different elements to the sport and the business. That's the pinnacle. But yeah, remembering it where it started in ice rinks in Altrincham near Manchester and little leisure centres and warehouses to where it is today it is incredible sometimes to look back.
What was the worst venue you ever did when you first started?
We had
are the ice rinks bad?
Yeah, the ice rinks are bad. We had this great idea of doing it in an ice rink, thinking, oh, it'll be cheaper, no one will ever book an ice rink, and then didn't realise how cold it would be, maybe stupidly, and we had to bring in generators and heaters, and it ended up, the humidity in there was just it was crazy, but those were the sort of things that we had to do at the start. So yeah, I've done everything. We've warehouses on industrial estates that we've had to suddenly turn into a boxing event overnight. As I say, old leisure centres. I think probably the worst one for boxing was just at the Indigo O2, and that's probably it. But just because it was a stage and we were putting a ring on a theatre stage. But yeah, some interesting ones for sure.
Yeah, I bet. Tailor the Tape, BOXXER, founded 2018.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're 30 years old.
Yeah.
And a rising force in boxing, not just in the UK, but beyond. And we've got so much to talk about, relationship with Sky Sports, which is growing and pretty established now. There's lots to talk about in the world of the relationship between boxing and media and what that looks like. Also, of course, crossover boxing. We'll find out who your favourite YouTuber is later, maybe. But tell us about the starting point for BOXXER. First of all, why boxing?
Why boxing? I mean, growing up in Manchester, it's like a second sport there. When I was growing up, there was guys coming through like Ricky Hatton, Amir Khan. And so there was those heroes and there was those pointers. But I grew up in a place where some friends were becoming professional boxers or amateur boxers. And so I was pretty exposed to it at an early age. I think I remember starting businesses when I was about 15, 16, events-based, music-based, underage events, and then progressed to students and festivals. But for me, once I'd finished studying and once I'd done everything, it was always, how can we create events that create content as well? And there was this glass ceiling with what we were doing with music events where it was pretty limited. You sold your tickets. It was a cash-based business, and I couldn't see where the vision was. And growing up in Manchester, boxing was something that I'd get involved in. I'd help in at local shows, and for me, it was always, I couldn't get my head around. I'd go to local shows, and it felt intimidating. It felt a bit murky. It felt a bit underdeveloped. And with the boxers who have to put in so much to their craft, and especially in a sport that doesn't offer too much opportunity, I couldn't understand why, for me, what the greatest sport in the world was, why couldn't it be packaged in a way that broadcasters were proud to be involved in it, sponsors were proud, because I realised early on, just from helping out on local events, a lot of brands would be like, boxing, don't really trust it, not going to get involved in that. And broadcasters as well would and ah, and so that was really the vision was, how can we make it a sport brands can be proud of? How can we change the perception of the sport? How can we make it more transparent? How can we innovate? And that's why, as the BOXXER brand sort of grew from, was we go to brands and we go to partners and say, they'd say, no, we don't want to get involved in boxing, and we'd say, this isn't boxing, this is BOXXER, and that's how it started. And that was, we sort of noticed in the industry there weren't major brands. If you look in mixed martial arts and even wrestling, they have some huge billion-dollar brands, and we wanted to create something that was next generation, that was fun, that was diverse, and that was how it started. But it's been a long journey since then. We started with streaming platforms, Unilad and Lab Bible, and especially at the time, Facebook Live was huge for numbers and advertisers. And with tournament formats, we developed into a fully fledged promoter, jumped around from 5 Spike, where we didn't get any TV money, to BT Sport, ITV4, all building the infrastructure, building the brand, building our capabilities, and then managed to land the one that we wanted for a long time, which was Sky Sports, and that's when the business really went to the next level.
We'll come on to talk about that in a bit more detail shortly. Did you ever box? Did you ever have any aspirations?
No, I wasn't very good. And so I realised very early on the only way I could be involved in the sport. I remember going into the gyms, and my first gym that I used to go into was a gym called Champs Camp in Manchester, in Moss Side, and I knew the trainers there, and that's where I promoted my first BOXXER. But the only way I was going to be in the sport was outside the ring.
A wise decision,
yeah,
probably.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, as you referenced, you're in a world, and you came into a world, and it probably is still a world where it's, as you said, still has the perception of being a little bit murky, a little bit old school, and you're coming into a world where there are some very established promoters. Am I allowed to name them? I don't know if I'm allowed to name them.
I'm not sure.
Okay, Mr. Hearn and Mr. Warren,
yeah,
amongst others.
Yeah.
What's that like, coming into that? You had this mission to change perception, actually change the reality around the sport, but change perceptions as well. What's that been like, coming into that pretty, at times pretty vicious world?
Yeah, intense. I think because we started at the grassroots small horse scene, the top end is sort of just a magnifying glass for what goes on at the bottom. And so building in that world was you learn some amazing life lessons, but it's a brutal place as well. There's no entrance exam to get into boxing, and it tests you all the time. I always said it's a brutal sport inside the ring, but it's a really brutal sport outside the ring as well. And I think the challenge when I first started was, how are we going to break into a sport that's been run by the same people, both in the UK and the US, for decades and decades, and it's a closed shop. And I think luckily I had age on my side, naivety on my side, and was able to sort of take a long-term approach, didn't have too many responsibilities from a family perspective, just was enjoying what I loved. And so those early years were very difficult, but also, as I say, because of where I was at in my life, quite enjoyable, like new experiences, and yes, brutal at times. And I think that's been the theme throughout it. We've always had to overcome all the odds. We've had to be strategic. We've had to really, anyone starting a business, I would say, working inside of it first and really looking under the bonnet. I think a lot of people look at businesses, think they understand it, but really, do they understand it and how it works? And that was how we broke in, by coming through the grassroots, understanding the licensing, the regulation, all the boring stuff, so that we could break in. And obviously now we're competing with the shows that I used to go to. Those promoters were promoting when I was 12, 13 years old at the top of the Manchester Arena, and now they're calling me a wanker every couple of days. And it's an interesting experience. It's a crazy experience, and it's been an amazing journey.
So you are growing your stable of boxers. You're going from ice rinks to bigger and better venues. And as you said, you're also, at the same time as you're trying to figure out the business, trying to figure out the media landscape, what that looks like. And then the deal with Sky Sports. Big moment, best moment so far?
It's weird because when we got that deal, there was all sorts of conspiracy theories as to why we got it. And I think we knew 18 months, 2 years out, and that's why it was about positioning for us. We need to find the right partner. For us, the vision was always, how can we make boxing more accessible? How can we take it to the mainstream audiences? And we needed the right partner to do that. So we had some TV offers before that point that, because we knew the Sky machine and the deal was going to come up and we wanted to be well positioned, we sort of treaded water and prepared for that. And so by the time it came off, we sort of knew 12 months probably before everyone else, and we were pretty well prepared to hit the ground running. I think when we started the business, the attraction was the broadcasting landscape was changing so much. And that's something I recognized in the early days. You know, boxing has no language barrier. It's a global sport. It's really easy to understand what's going on, and it thrives in short form environments. And with the competition, with Amazon, with Netflix, with DAZN, with BT Sport, Sky Sports, if we could bring something different to the table as a rights holder, we were going to get our opportunities. And obviously Sky Sports happened, and it was a game changer for us, and we went on to sign some incredible talent. 80% of the Olympians in the Tokyo team, most successful team that we've had in GB, signed with us, signed some incredible world champions, promoted Amir Khan, who was surreal for me, the reason I got into the sport. I'm now promoting his last fight and possibly one of his biggest fights. So it was definitely the springboard, the platform that we always needed.
There was a session earlier on today about the fragmenting world of sports media rights and how it's much more complex for promoters and for leagues and for anybody who's got sports rights to sell. And it seems to me that, looking from the outside, boxing promoters and the broadcasters that they work with have a particularly close relationship. So just tell us exactly how it works in terms of things like, you know, agreeing on who's fighting when, the schedule, sort of the influence that a Sky has in the partnership, and actually what the, because I presume it is a true partnership, what that actually looks like day to day, month to month. Yeah,
I think that's a challenge broadcasters have always had with boxing. I think the line I get is it counts for 5% of their budget, but 60-70% of their time. It's a crazy sport. It's constantly changing. Fighters get injured, events change, promoter wars, politics, fights not getting made, changes in the landscape in terms of the investment that's coming into it. And so it's one of them where you have to be really close-knit with your broadcaster and really understand what they want. And the key for us as a business and as a rights holder really is to be a broadcaster first promoter, and that means scheduling around their key events. That means finding the right dates. We had an event recently on an Easter Sunday at the O2, and the whole point of that was Manchester City are playing Arsenal at 4 o'clock. We're going to have a 4 million audience. We want to generate those numbers into our BOXXERs after. And you have to work around that with Sky, and they have their preferences very much so. I think with Sky, more than anyone, there's so many sports and there's so many big moments that for us it's about what are those slots where boxing's really going to take precedence and get those viewing figures and take to the mainstream. But it is something that broadcaster almost on a daily basis is discussing fights, is planning events, is talking about which venues and talking about what experiences to create.
And I guess historically the other element that boxing on TV, boxing media, has had is the pay-per-view model, certainly a more established model than in any other sport, definitely. Yeah. As a general view, how do you feel about pay-per-view? You know, are we gently moving away from that as the model?
I think as the model, yes. There's still a place for it. It still drives significant revenue. And when you're the fighters demanding the paydays that they do, it's sort of impossible to get away from. The biggest challenge is piracy. We're seeing it everywhere now, and particularly boxing, the fire sticks, the ability to watch it on Twitter and just to Google it. And obviously that really hurts boxing. And I think that's why you're starting to see subscription platforms. That's why you're starting to see boxing live streamed on social media platforms. And now a lot of our big events that traditionally we might try and put on pay-per-view now sit as part of your Sky Sports subscription. So definitely still a place for it, but challenging because of piracy and because of the different forms of media that now exist. You've obviously, Netflix are doing their first boxing event, and I think it's just become very, very competitive. But it all stems from boxing now driving a huge amount of eyeballs across the world. It's transgressed really from being a local sport to a global sport, and pay-per-view has its place. But yeah, over time, I can see it becoming more of a subscription model.
And as you say, boxing has all the numbers are all good, and yet my sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, would be that from a sponsorship and advertising point of view has probably under-delivered compared to its potential. And I guess this is at the heart of you looking with BOXXER to change how people see boxing and what boxing is.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, we invested huge amounts into women's boxing. We're now the biggest exporter of women's boxing in the world. We did the first ever women's boxing event at the O2. I mean, all female was the highest ever event, women's sporting event Sky have ever had. And I think for me, that's a golden bullet for boxing. It changes, not just for women's boxing, but for boxing as a whole. It changes the perception of the sport. If women can fight, there's not much more that they can't do. And that was always central to the vision. But when we started, luckily, we didn't have TV support. So we had to build a whole model around brands. And we used to have a tournament called the Ultimate BOXXER, where it was a 360 integration. All the fighters would have to do their content, would wear the same things. Every fighter was in yellow and in green and in blue. And it was trying to create a more 360 integrated opportunity for sponsors. And over time, we've managed to bring in brands that otherwise wouldn't look at the sport. And I think the numbers, as you say, that it does, aren't reflected by the amount of brands that come in. It's still a very, very cheap way of advertising, really, in comparison to the bigger sports, because of the numbers that it does. And it's now trying to find that sweet spot where you do start to see those tier one brands saying, I can be associated with this. I'm proud to be a part of this sport, rather than I'm not going to take the risk of it. And I think that's the challenge that boxing has, particularly with pay-per-view falling away. A lot of it's going to become advertising funded, and that's what boxing needs to focus on, is how we're going to bring those advertisers into the sport.
It's a long time. Was it the Sun who always used to, at the last minute, put their logos on the back of shorts of the loser?
Yeah.
Yeah, those days are gone, I think.
They are.
Yeah. You mentioned it earlier, specifically about getting abused every other day on the internet. And this world of online boxing channels is quite something, isn't it? I was having a flick through, and it's true, you really do get abused. And there's a sort of, it's like a 24/7 media, sort of unofficial media service around boxing, where promoters and fighters and the politics and the business of the sport is being discussed in almost real time.
Yeah.
That must be very annoying.
It is. I mean, at the start, it's like the Wild West, you know. It's the Wild West of the sport, but the media circus is ridiculous. I mean, we've got a new team now on that communication side coming from other sports, and they come to the press conference and they can't quite believe the access. I'll walk in and you'll have about 14 YouTubers running over that have just bought a camera, and they can basically do what they want and go anywhere that they want. And it is a circus, but it also is part of the intrigue. It's also part of the interest. I think there's no other sport, I think, where you, as you said, have business owners going at each other in such an overt way. And I think as a young company coming through, especially, you know, you have to take it for what it is. We're going into an established industry that hasn't been broken into for 30, 40 years. We're going to be met with resistance. And really, the more success we've had, the more intense it's got. I think, as I say, at the start, when you're not used to it, especially the whole media circus, it's like, wow, this is crazy. You know, I never imagined that you know, there'd be more interest in sometimes the promoters than the fighter, which I think there shouldn't be. But once you get used to it, it can be a bit of fun as well. And I think that's what boxing is. It's entertainment, it's extreme, and yeah, it's something that I think by now I'm pretty used to.
We'll come on to talk about entertainment in a little bit, but I'm really interested in terms of the extent to which you are looking at other sports and how they run, what they're doing from a media perspective. Again, we had a session earlier talking about Netflix buying WWE rights and what that means, and there's obviously, you know, football dominates in this country. Are you really taking an active look to try and understand what's going on in those other worlds? A, to see if there's something you can learn, and B, to you know, I guess sort of see if there's anything that can help you practically grow what you're doing.
Yeah, I think so. I think a promoter really, without a TV partner or a broadcaster, like the promoters can make out that they're the most important thing in the world, but the reality is it's the broadcasters funding the sport. It's who's going to put their money in to whether it's Netflix, whether it's Sky, whether it's ITV. So you have to have a pretty you have to have your finger on the pulse with where the broadcast mediums are going. And as you said, the Netflix WWE deal is a landmark deal, not just for wrestling, but for the whole of combat sports. And it just shows how much, you know, interest that's driving now. And as I say, these combat sports in particular, they're truly global. They really are. We sell our events in over 150 countries in the world just because of the interest, because of the relatability, the storytelling. We've just done a deal with NBC and Peacock, who are losing WWE to Netflix, but have the Premier League and have a lot of the big rights out there. So for me, boxing's actually quite innovative, I believe, in the sporting landscape in terms of how it monetizes. You've got fights on subscription platforms, you've got fights on free-to-air platforms like Channel 5, you've got fights on Netflix, you've got fights now on Amazon Prime in the US. I mean, it's one of those sports that, as we predicted when we started, I believe it's the sport future-proofed. You know, you look at the sports like cricket and golf now coming up with shorter formats that can survive in the next generation of media consumption. Boxing is ready-made for that, and it's explosive and it creates viral content consistently. And as I say, it can be understood all around the world. So I think boxing is pretty much on the forefront of innovative, you know, solutions to broadcast.
What about the worlds of music and fashion? I mean, what are the crossover opportunities or the collaboration opportunities that you see with those spaces and what you're doing? Yeah,
I mean, it is something that I probably didn't. When we started with a brand called Ultimate Boxer, and the only way we could sell tickets was influencers driving content and making it an entertainment experience. We had Big Nasty perform on one of our first shows, which was a ridiculous experience, but also just showed, you know, how we needed to use music, fashion to bring interest into the shows. But it's just developed and gone on to another world. We have a fighter called Ben Whittaker now, who's just done a big deal with Diesel. I have another fighter with Richard Riakporhe, who's become a Burberry catwalk model in the process of being a professional boxer. And those are the fighters now that are getting to the forefront, those that understand it. You know, we saw on there JME and Tom Grennan and different music artists getting involved. We've got Catherine Jenkins, who's singing one of our fighters out in Cardiff in a couple of weeks' time, and that's what boxing's about. It's about entertainment, and it's another reason why it's thriving so much now when we're seeing music coming into sport, when we're seeing fashion coming into sport. And a lot of the time, as I say, it's the boxers that really understand that are the ones that are creating a star for themselves.
Which probably brings us on to YouTube and boxing, which is a thing. Good thing or bad thing in your mind?
We promote professional boxing, and that is our core focus, and it's how do we change the perception of professional boxing. a lot is made of YouTube boxing. For me, it's these YouTubers have such a big audience. They could play table tennis, or they could go and swim down there, and they'd still get millions of views. I think
and to be honest, they probably have.
They probably have.
Yeah.
I've seen them. They've done football games. They've done anything. I've seen all sorts of concepts, which is what brands are trying to come up with the whole time. But what better environment for something to go viral is actually getting them to fight. And that's what it is. It's like, well, we've got these two guys that everyone watches their every move. What's going to create the most viral content? And it's getting them to fight. And I think that is why boxing's in such a good place, because it's something that will go around the world and people will understand. And I think all it is this is a generation of influencers and personal brands and personal followers mixed with the rawest form of entertainment come together, and you create an explosion. And I think for me, it's good for boxing if people understand it's not professional boxing. Sometimes I see it advertised as such, and it's worlds apart. It's a different discipline. But at the end of the day, you've got people watching people fight that otherwise wouldn't, that you hope then it creates an interest in the sport. So for me, no problem with it, as long as it's signposted that it is celebrity boxing after all, and it's not the professional sport.
Just a couple more questions. One thing that you've learnt so far in your career as boxing promoter, and maybe one thing that you think you still need to learn?
Good question. I think the one thing I've learned is to block out the noise. Sometimes you're trying to put on fights that fans want you to put on, or because of certain things, or you're trying to do this because certain people are saying that. Stay to your vision. Stay true to your vision. What's your long-term goal? And for us, it's making the sport a better place. It's investing in regulation, governance, inclusivity, women's boxing. Although it might be not every boxing fan's dream, it's helping the whole global ecosystem. And so, blocking out the noise. And focusing on the brand and what you want to achieve for the sport is definitely something in my early years that I had to be, stay on track. One thing that I've not learned yet.
Think about it, that's actually quite a hard question, but
yeah, there's plenty of things, obviously. I think what comes with experience as a promoter, I feel like as a business we're strong, but talent development, a lot of these guys are young guys, come from nothing, suddenly have huge amount of followers, or they're experiencing. There's nothing really more intense than fighting in front of people for a living. And then the effect that can have on their mental health, the effect that can have on them day to day. I think that comes with experience, being able to help them with that, and I see it now day to day, and that's probably why a lot of the promoters are in their 70s and 80s. But no, in all seriousness, I think it's that management and helping sportsmen and women develop in that environment.
And just finally, for anybody who might want to be checking out a BOXXER show, what's next on your agenda? We
are in Cardiff on May the 11th. Lauren Price, gold medalist and MBE from Tokyo. She fights for her first world title, so that'll be a big event in Cardiff. Then we're off to Poland, where we started to do a few events, and then we're at Selhurst Park on June the 15th. We've got a huge event at Crystal Palace that will be announced next week, live on Sky Sports. And so, yeah, those are 2 or 3 of our upcoming events.
Good stuff. Ben, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you. Cheers.